Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I am really excited for today's conversation, the part two of our talk with John Creger. In our last conversation, we had an amazing time talking about John's background that led him into education and the genesis of his Creed project. He was an English teacher at the high school that I went to for over 3 decades and built a really unique approach to teaching centered around this particular project that invites students to reflect deeply on their beliefs, values, and purpose. Today, we delve a little bit more into his transformative teaching philosophy and how it nurtures the next generation of thinkers and leaders. How are you doing today?
Oh, thank you, Gautam. It's great to be here with you, and I'm doing really well. I am feeling kind of energized, even though it's the end of the day.
Yeah, we had an amazing conversation. We started recording our part two and we were about 20 minutes in, and then I had the hardest time with our Wi-Fi, and I thought, I still think back to even those 20 minutes that we had chatted about because we had started talking about the history of Fremont. And as a only child of immigrants who didn't grow up around a lot of family, something I have a hard time accepting is that there was a world that existed before I got here. And so, to even reflect on the fact that American high school has such a long history where, and I'm kind of excited. I would love to start the conversation again there if you don't mind, but talking about how the places that I felt like was home had been home to so many people before me. It's always such a weird experience. And I think it's one of those very humbling experiences as you get older to kind of recognize that this world is home to many people outside of
Right.
yourself. But I'm very curious, and I thought we could maybe start with talking about the history of Fremont and what it was like when you
Absolutely.
started teaching there and how it kind of changed over the 35 years.
Well, first, I want to salute you for your honesty about that discomfort that you talked about when you discovered that. Wait, I wasn't the first here. That's that's got to be a a feeling that all human beings share. In the process of kind of coming into awareness of the wider world, right? As we grow and as we, just become aware that there's this thing called history, and
Yeah.
we're just where we are in this long progression. But I'll go even a little further than last time back into Fremont history. I think I mentioned to you that before I became a teacher, I was in construction. I left home, as we talked about, I think in the first session. I left home. Father was a professor. I was a misfit, and my route to discovering who I was and where I belonged was to leave home and find a way of becoming independent as much as possible. So I joined the Carpenters Union, and one of my first jobs actually was in Fremont in 1971. And this was the year before, now that I think of it, American high school was built. And the way I like to think of it is back then in Fremont was more of a working class community. Then the necks were red and the collars were blue, right? Red necks and blue collars, right? And so we were building a medical center. I don't recall exactly where it was, but that was my impression of Fremont in the early 70s. In the When I came to teach in Fremont in the late 80s, I noticed that the necks were lots of different colors, and the collars. So were the collars. It's more white collars than there were before. So there's that evolution from more of a working class community to a mixed community. We still had in the late 80s, early 90s, we still had a transient population at American high school. So we had lots of socio-economic diversity, but we didn't have too much in the wealthy part of the hierarchy. Um, so the one of the things that all of us teachers appreciated about American high school at the north end of Fremont was that the kids didn't have quote unquote silver spoons in their mouths. They didn't feel entitled to what we could offer them. There was a sort of an appreciation there, and I think I said in our conversation previously that um, that that mindset still, I think, it does exist, even though students are under far more pressure now academically in terms of expectations. Immigrant families, as well, of course, under lots of expectations, of people who have come here and sacrificed a lot to be here for their children. So there's that tremendous change from the early 70s to here we are now in the 2020s. It's a long span. There might have been other things that you asked me about in terms
Yeah, I
of
mean, some of the things that was really fascinating for me the first time is you talked about how in the 80s, I believe, you talked about the different migration pools of where at first it was a lot of Afghan refugees who was that in the 80s, I believe?
the Afghans started coming here in 79 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and
Mm,
they originally I think the first groups came to Hayward, which is the next town north of Fremont. And by the time I showed up to teach at American in 87, there was a significant Afghan population, and so there was an Afghan population, there was Hispanic population, and African American population. The majority was white in 87. Vast majority were white kids, um, and and again they were a significant Mormon population, and still is at American, I think. And that's just one community. But the Mormons have an open, hardworking kind of mindset that I think has always been part of American high school. But now, I mean, so is the Afghan tradition. So now is the South Asian tradition part of American high school, and the
mm,
East Asian traditions. And Afghans are Central Asians, right? So, all of those now, those groups have been at American long enough so that they're all a part of American high school and the Hispanic tradition. One thing I may have mentioned and if I didn't, I should, is that along about 2000, I want to say 5 to 2010, in there somewhere. At that point, American high school, where I taught and you were a student, there was no significant racial, ethnic, if you want to distinguish between racial, ethnic, religious um, majority in the school. There was no significant majority. There were 30 some percent white kids then, 30 some percent Asian kids, something like 15% Hispanic. And then there was maybe 10% Black. So whatever group you were a part of as a student, there were enough others who looked like you. And I think
mm,
that was probably the time when the environment at American was the most comfortable for the most people.
mm. You know, it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, being in Japan now, when this number 30% Asian is kind of like thrown out there. And it's something I reflect on of even being back in the at American. I mean, there's even within that 30%, I mean, there might be 5% that's Indian, 3% that's Pakistani, 2% that's Bangladeshi, 10% that's Chinese, like 8% that's Korean. I mean, it's even among that kind of broad generalization term of Asian, there is so much diversity. And I think one thing that really brought that out for me is when I was spending time in India, realizing how different even small little parts of India are. So even using the word Indian is kind of it can sometimes minimalize how diverse I think people's experience at American was, even now when I think it is 40 or 50% Asian. I mean, but people come from very different parts of the world. And I think I was having an amazing conversation. It will be released 2 episodes before this one with a girl, Sarah Tribble, who I went to school with. And we spoke a lot about what that experience was like, because that's not something most people get to experience. I mean, we were able to make friends with people from around the entire world, when we were 10 or 11 years old, which I think is fascinating. And it offers a unique perspective into understanding what it means to be American. I'm curious from your side, teaching, and I think I remember you said I think you were a few generations ago had immigrated. I think you have been your family has been in the States for some time. Is that correct?
Yeah, my great grandparents came here.
Yes.
So yeah, so
Where did
that's
they? And so I guess one question I have for you, and I'm really curious, what was it like for you to teach children of immigrants, right? I mean, I think the experience can be so vastly different than someone who grew up here, who has been here for quite some time. Did you find, especially in the beginning years, that to be a little bit of a transition? What was that like for you?
well, in my case, I've always, since I was a child, I've always been drawn to people who are different. I've always been curious about people who look different than I do, who have come from different backgrounds. And then the other factor is that I left the place I grew up as kind of a misfit. I didn't really feel like I belonged there. And so I'm always looking for some place to belong. Um, and I'd been places. I'd lived in Black community in East Palo Alto, where I made friends that made me feel like I belonged. I lived in rural New England, where I also managed to feel like I belonged. But I think American high school was the first place that I felt I really belonged, and that didn't happen suddenly. It slowly I began to realize, and I've realized now what made me feel like I belonged there was that I was a part of so many uh so many young people's journeys in life.
Hmm.
I was asked one of my last years at the school, a colleague asked me, "So what's kept you here all these years?" And I said, "I'm really glad you asked me." And the answer was so clear. It's being part of so many young people's life journeys.
Hmm. And I think when you live in a place like Fremont, or when you work with people from Fremont, one of the, I think, really beautiful aspects of being an immigrant or a child of an immigrant is like figuring out and learning what it means to be American. And I think the role models that you have, especially when you're young, really set that model of like, this is what it means to be American. And the number of students I know who still remember you years after, a decade or so after they were either in your class or have heard of you, speaks to kind of what you did, what you taught, and the person that you were, and how influential your kind of models set for them as what it meant, because you were an integral part of someone who was quote unquote American. And so I think something else you mentioned the last time we spoke, which I wanted to reiterate again, because I think it sets a good foundation for how you were able to even be in an environment where something like the Creed Project was able to be kind of ran with, was how when American high school was first founded, it seemed to be a very innovative school with the innovative principal and with innovative teachers. And they kind of supported this environment of this very interdisciplinary form of education. Can you speak a little bit more about what school was like then? Because that seems like a dream to me.
Well, it was a dream on one hand and a nightmare on the other hand, as so often life is, right? The school was designed, our principal, our founding principal, Joe Tranquina, designed the school with an architect. He had permission from the district to innovate, and they wanted to design a school. Joe is comes from an Italian background, and Mediterranean people are warm. They like to communicate, and they like to be in close touch with other people. So the school was designed with a central rotunda, and all students, the hope was that they would mix and mingle and get to know each other. Different groups of kids would get to know each other. The faculty area was called the Faculty Commons. And instead of having, the history department in one corner and the English in the other, they had us in carrels, small desks, with shelf to put your stuff in, and they purposefully mixed us up. So I'm between a science teacher and a math teacher, and I'm an English teacher. And they wanted us to cross-pollinate. So the physical design of the school was built for that. And the wings, I think maybe I don't recall mentioning this, but the wings where the classrooms were, well, there were no rooms. The wings were huge, open wings with movable partitions 6 feet
So there was
tall.
no classrooms back then, huh?
No, it was called an open space concept, and it was a period in education that kind of the early mid 70s, where that's when they built open space schools. There were at least half a dozen of them around the Bay Area, and the purpose was so that teachers did not become isolated in their classrooms. So
Hmm.
I'm teaching in a cove. I have, some separation between you're teaching next to me, you're my colleague. And so let's say you're another English teacher and we want to show a movie together or we want to have an activity together. We just move the partition out of the middle and we have the kids mix and mingle and teach that way. So it was it was delightful in the social interaction of the school, staff, students. Um, it was delightful in that regard. It was exhausting to teach because the volume it was loud, and
Hmm.
you had to learn how to control. I think I probably could teach in a free under a freeway overpass if I really had to, even now, just because we got used to catching their attention and holding it. And so, the downside was that by the time I came to the school in '87, that was 15 years into open space. Um, the original teachers that Joe Tranchina hired were already getting pretty tired. And by the time um, Joe retired in 92, 93, and by the time lots of them started retiring in around 2000, they were really tired. Right? But
Hmm.
I only had 7 years of open space, and for me, um, it just kind of prepared me to be pretty versatile as a teacher, I think.
I mean, I can imagine half the people my age who went to American if they had listened to the story that you just said. I mean, it seems we went to a school that classrooms regimented. You got to do these to get into the APs, to get into the blah, 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 blah. The whole process from day one, the second you step on, the most open thing that I can think of was the fact that we had a few electives that we could choose out of. And even out of those, everyone ended up doing the same stuff. I mean, it's, when do you feel like that transition slowly happened? I know you mentioned a little bit about Bush's No Child Left Behind when standardization became a lot more popular. What was kind of the transition where we moved away from this more open-ended approach to education to a far more authoritarian kind of approach?
Yeah, yeah. Some of it was the national stage, the political urge to kind of gain control over education that was by some people's standards a little too open-ended. In the believe is '80s and '90s, there was a move about a move to demand a certain basic set of knowledge that everyone should be taught. Um, Seymour Hersh was one of those people, I believe, and was it Alan Bloom or Harold Bloom? I've forgotten. One of those two um, wrote a book about the basic knowledge that every student should be taught. And that philosophy began to erode the progressive notions of education that were driving a school like American high school, which was attempted to be student-centered. And student-centeredness really goes back to John Dewey. And at some point, we may have a chance to bring that up a little bit. Um, but so there was that kind of conservative idea that we should have common knowledge We should read common books and know common things, and then, go on from there. And then
Mm,
there was in the late 90s, mid late 90s, the testing industry began to realize testing and textbook industries are interlinked, that there was profit to be made for offering tests to test this basic knowledge and basic, skills. Um, so then political careers began to, oh, well, I can bring that about because Johnny Can't Read was one of the books that was put out, I believe, in the 80s, late 80s, could have been earlier. And that was one of the books that said, no, we need to have basic knowledge. Everyone needs to know these things. And yeah, so we have to be more rigid about things. So the progressive approach, which was about engaging the individual child, um, was always a newcomer, and it didn't flower everywhere. It did in California. California had some leaders that for a few years in the early 90s, there was even a requirement that teachers teach reflective writing, reflection,
mm,
a requirement at the state level. And by the time your generation came along, um, you guys weren't asked to reflect, if very often at all, in your writing. Listen to you, yeah,
reflection, what is that?
exactly. When my students took in the first couple of steps in the personal creed experience, which is all about reflection and then culminates in a presentation, they were stumped, and they were stymied. They were kind of like, "What is this?" And I told them, "That's where you're going to feel for a while."
Hmm.
But this used to be um, a basic a part of an expectation that we that we teach children to be reflective about their lives and about meaning and purpose.
We had a policy historian on the show who mentioned a really interesting point of how social change usually happens. She said that it works kind of like a pendulum, where you
Mhm.
often you have one status quo, and then you eventually push to the other side, and you're like, "We're here now, and we love this." And then eventually you start noticing the failings with that, and then eventually, once a new generation has come and forgotten the old way, they want to now swing back to the other side. I'm really curious if perhaps if we look through history, this constant ebb and flow of going from a place of open education, everyone gets to learn what they want, free, into this more like, okay, we need structure, we need to make sure that it's very systematic. And then you kind of naturally go through this flow. Because I'm curious, what were some of the shortcomings you saw in the open kind of style? Because you mentioned reading, and I would assume even in an open style, people were still being taught to read. What were some of the shortcomings in that system that actually wanted people to move towards more structure? Was it hard for people to find employment, or what was it?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think it was those who believe in education measurement, in measuring progress, found it difficult to find um, ways in to measure progress in a more student-centered approach. But I believe that that's not um, uh, an unchangeable characteristic. In fact, I'm thinking about this a lot now because as this conversation goes on, I think you'll be asking me, oh, well, what is classroom research as far as I experience classroom research, as far as I understand it. And but just to kind of get to a point a little further that we might come back to again, I think I could and should have been a little bit more quantitative about the research that I've done in the classroom. Um, I was so enthralled, and still am, with the extraordinary things that students say about their experience when they learn about themselves in kind of a systematic way in conjunction with their curriculum in a natural way. They they are very enthused and positive about that. And this is I have huge documentation about this. But it would have been so I have qualitative research. I have lots of qualitative research, but you can't communicate that quickly and efficiently. I have to give a presentation with examples and videos to communicate the benefits of the research that I've been engaged in and um, the the kind of approach to learning that my research has led me to. But what I could have done, and I think so that this is why I don't necessarily think the pendulum swings are um, eternal, and they need to be eternal. I could have taken this qualitative approach, and maybe I still can. Maybe it can be done. And at the beginning of a year, ask kids 5 questions. Um, how much do you know about the forces and the people that have shaped you? Scale of 1 to 6. Do you understand how you've come to be the way you are? Do you how to what degree do you understand what you value? Do you have a vision for your life? Scale of 1 to 6. Questions like that. And then at the end of this process, give it to them again. And then I would have had quantitative data. I would have been able to say, 64% of students felt like they had, or probably it's going to be more in the 90s, they felt that they had a better sense of what they valued, how they had been shaped, and what vision for their life, how they wanted to serve others. I wish I'd coached to quantify the effects of the kind of progressive approach that I think I did.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
I mean, as a data scientist, 100%. Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. And it's interesting because I've spoken to a few organizations who really have trouble with this because I've seen what their work has done, and it is without a doubt a net positive. And I very rarely would say this. There's some organizations that I work with. The one that I'm thinking about right now is called One All. They teach life skills to indigenous children through the sport of ultimate frisbee. But it
Hmm.
truly is a phenomenal job that they do. And but it's hard to put a number to it. What am I supposed to say? Like how many more frisbees they're able to catch now, or like how happy they are, or like what number? Because there's so much complexity to that. Because even in doing that, you start making the importance about the number, whether you want to or not. If you know that you need to convey this number so that someone else can understand it, you start to now have this battle with yourself where it's like, well, it didn't go up this that much this year. Like, what does that mean? Like, did I, even though, maybe it works better, or there's so many things I think even about the example that you gave where students have to one write how much have they reflected on something versus at the end of the year, they may have just never even done that to know what it even is. So obviously that their score is going to go higher at the end if you spend a whole year doing it. But that doesn't even mean that it was done well or right. It just means that they did it, right? Because if, for example, if I asked a student, how much do you think about the engine of a car? And then I give a whole year about talking about the engine of a car, the amount they think about the engine of a car will obviously go up. But it doesn't mean I actually did the teaching of the engine of the car well.
Okay. Okay. That's an example of um, knowledge that is general knowledge, right? And so, but if you're talking about um, self-knowledge, um, it, you probably you want to have 5 questions on your survey that are generally, we think this is, everyone would agree, these are outcomes that we we need, right? And I actually have a great example for you. So my friend I'm working with, Dan Zhao, he and I are part of the Personal Creed organization, and he's been talking with the counseling department at Irvington High School. Irvington High School in Fremont has a wellness initiative, because wellness is something that everyone agrees we need more of in a district like Fremont, with the academic pressures really, you know, creating tremendous stress and questionable value, right? So Dan is inviting me to come in, and I think we're going to be going this week or next to speak with the counselors there and to suggest the idea that part of wellness, maybe there are two parts of wellness. There's self-care and self-knowledge. And so we think I'm going to propose that everyone would agree that a little bit of self-knowledge is a good thing when it comes to wellness, right? So if you measure, and measuring it's pretty informal measuring. It's not precise measuring. You don't want that, I don't think, when you're measuring self-knowledge, self-awareness, scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 6, I don't know. And you know, how 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 much self-knowledge do I feel I have at the beginning of my ninth grade year? And then do it again at the beginning of the 10th grade, beginning of um, 12th grade. At the end of high school, these um, and in a way, what you're trying to measure isn't just the teaching. Well, you're trying to measure the student's growth, and I think that's the big thing that is that is missing.
Hmm. I guess I'm trying to think. Okay, so like take that survey that you get because I think this is a really important conversation, particularly there's a certain way I think the hard sciences can be taught and can be understood. And so, for example, like you said earlier, if it's a very quantifiable thing of how much do you know about X topic, I think it can actually be quantified well. But when
Mhm.
it comes to something a lot more ethereal, like something that's a question that you're going to be solving for the rest of your life, like what does it mean to be you? The second you put a number to it, I think it becomes something completely different. And I understand the desires for many people wanting to do that. But a good example I can think about is even in that survey you gave me. I think every year I would have said, I know myself at a 5. And then the next year, I would have also said the previous version of me knew themselves at a 1, but now me today, I know myself at a 5. And I would have
Oh,
kept
okay.
doing this every year again and again and again.
Oh, wow.
And and I think the context of being like you I think as an adult, I think oftentimes a lot of these things, especially when it comes to education, are thought of how an adult would go about it and what would it mean for an adult. Like they would be able to place themselves on a larger scale of who they're going to be 20 years from now. And then they're like, okay, I only know myself at a 4. But like I personally don't feel younger children have even, and including me at this point in my life, have lived long enough to even have the humility of being like, I am going to know more in the future. Like you always at any given time feel like you know it all at that moment in your life. And I feel that when it comes to reflection, I'm even thinking about the thing that came to my mind is the health class, which eventually was quantified. How much do you actually know about your body? How much do you know? Rather than it being an experience that you have to go through. I totally feel like health should have never been given a grade. Health should have never, it should have been an experience for you to understand what is happening in your body. That is
Mm,
a very important course that has nothing to do with school. I took that course as an extra thing because I needed to pass it because it was a requirement because I needed to get to
mhm.
college. I did what? How? But the second you put something to a number where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, we need to make sure that we need to quantify this, it becomes about someone else. I think about this with the STAR tests that we took. The STAR tests have all to do with how a school is performing, yet every student somehow ends up personalizing it. It means something about them. And so then there's this whole world around it. Even though it was built something that had nothing to do with the student, it becomes something that now you have to worry about it. Maybe you have to stress out about it. You got to sit there and take this test. I just think we need to completely rethink our relationship with numbers.
Mm,
And I think a big part of it is a lot of people aren't actually very quantitatively capable. So numbers are this really like ominous thing. So when they see a number like 26% increase, they're like, wow, it increased by 26%. That really means something. But
Right.
I think the more comfortable you become with numbers and you understand how much numbers lie and how much they really don't tell the answer. So I've worked with some kind of schools that, test the boundaries a bit and they take a really harsh stance against any number. And I
Yeah,
know that's the other intense, that's the other extreme, right? Where it's like, how do you ever make a decision if you have no numbers? But I think the balance lies somewhere in the middle. And I feel like we try to always solve our answers with putting more numbers, more, maybe more accurate
right.
numbers. Let's build a better standardized test that actually, I worked with, I had a few researchers for the ETS and GRE on the show, and they were building a more complex standardized test to even more accurately be able to predict a student's success in college. And
Hmm.
it's intense that I think we want to move towards this world where it's more and more numbers so we can predict accurately how are you doing, how are we doing. But it's like sometimes learning is just this fluid process that there is no
Absolutely.
number to. And so sorry, I mean, sorry, I feel so
No, this
passionate
is
about this. I
important.
had to, I'm sorry.
No, no,
I had
this
to
is
go on a
the
tangent about this.
no, it's not a tangent at all. I mean, first you're a data scientist, and someone like you and someone like me, we need to talk to each other. I think it's very important. I need to listen too. You're probably quite familiar with UC Santa Cruz and the fact that they gave no grades for the first, God, I don't know, 40 years of their existence, maybe.
Hmm.
They that the professors wrote paragraphs for each student, or they wrote a verbal assessment. Um, and so there's a lot to be said for a long tradition of not emphasizing numbers so much. They did eventually. I think that the decision was made because UC Santa Cruz had to communicate with graduate schools around the world, and
Yes.
the graduate schools weren't equipped to digest all these narratives. But I think what I'm leaning toward, this is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's called The Innocent Classroom. And if you ever had the chance to pick this up, I know the author now. I picked it up um, accidentally right in the October of 2020. And it's called The Innocent Classroom, Dismantling Racial Bias to Support Students of Color. And it's by Alex Pate, who is a novelist, a poet, who wrote the book Amistad, the story of the rebellion on the slave ship. Um, so this is a very qualitative body of work. It's really to just quickly encapsulate it. This is about what he's saying is that the problem with marginalized students, whether students of color or other marginalized students, it's a it's bridging the relationship gap, not the achievement gap. Talking
Hmm.
about the relationship gap between teacher and student. This book is filled with beautiful wisdom on that. I read it and I implemented it that first year online when we did distance learning, and I found it really worked beautifully. And then I did it my next 2 years in the classroom, and then by the end of my 3 years of piloting this approach, I was training other teachers, and I just got done training an elementary school in Union City. The point I want to raise is that this guy has this beautiful qualitative work, but he has this one page in the book in which he reports data. And yeah, he says here, this is just a half a page, right?
Hmm.
And here's some numbers. 92% of educators reported an increase in academic mindset when they used innocent classroom strategies, right?
Hmm.
Reported teacher observations. 87% of educators reported seeing greater than usual academic growth in some or most of their students. And 86% of educators reported stronger relationships with students as a result of this training. So then there's a couple of others too. But what I find exemplary in this is that this is an approach that transforms relationships between teacher and student, and eventually whole classes. I've seen this. But you keep simple numbers to just report out to the rest of the world so they know that this is going somewhere because and you don't get obsessed with those numbers, right?
Mm.
What you look at you look at student, you can look at student achievement. Look at the academic numbers, student achievement. You look at student engagement. Um, because you're trying to create more student engagement by building better relationships between students and teachers. So I just think I hope I didn't get off on too much of a tangent there,
No,
but I
I love,
really think that's a beautiful use of quantitative data in there.
yeah,
I'm in awe of it, and I've gotten to know this guy now, and yeah, he's a great guy. He's a
yeah.
phenomenal. If you were looking for somebody really revolutionary to interview, well, okay, I shouldn't be telling you your job here.
No, no, I mean, no, definitely send me that person's like email or whatever, and I'll definitely
I
reach out to
will.
them.
I
Yeah.
will.
And it's interesting. Before we move on, the last thing I wanted to say is you mentioned the difference between the achievement gap versus the relationship gap. And it's really interesting because then a quantitative person would come and be like, let's put a number on relationship. How many times do you talk to the
Yeah.
teacher a day? How many, rather than, I think there is something really beautiful about being attuned to your classroom, to your work, to what you're doing, to like
Hmm.
actually get a good sense of what is working and what doesn't. I think what you said earlier, I had another professor, actually, one of the very first conversations we had. She was really revolutionary in some of her ideas. And I want to convert this into talking a little bit about deepened learning and to understand a little bit about your entire understanding of why we learn. What is knowledge? Why do we learn? Because something she had mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, was this whole kind of prestige that exists behind learning. There's a whole bunch of auxiliary reasons people now learn that has nothing to do with learning itself. It has to do with, I got to go to Harvard, so I get to wear the sweater and tell everyone I went to Harvard. I get to get, my kid is in the honor roll, so I get to stick a sticker on my bumper car and tell everyone my kid's on the honor roll. Right? I mean, there's so much aesthetic that now comes with being intelligent or whatever, performing well in school that has nothing to do with actually being curious or loving learning. And so her whole thing was, and you said you were right, Santa Cruz had to change their policies so that you could go to grad school somewhere else in a different state, in a different country to communicate to them this person is intelligent. But when you have localized learning systems like in Barrios, in Barrios in Puerto Rico or whatever, where your learning is done in the community, there's no need for you to communicate with someone hundreds or thousands of miles away about how competent you are. Everyone knows you. And so your learning becomes deeply, you don't need to ever communicate to someone how intelligent you are because everyone knows whether you are or not, or in what ways you are intelligent is probably a better way to say that. And
That is a
so,
better way.
and so I think in that sense, you no longer have the need for this, like, we need to now communicate without words or without action. We have to now communicate with numbers because that's the only way you can transport that much information that far away. So I think like that comes back to maybe we need to rethink the entire structure. It cannot be changed just inside of a classroom or just inside. It can't just be changed with one teacher. It has to be deeply systematic in that perhaps the whole way we think about learning, which is why I think it starts with the philosophy, which is now our segue into talking a little bit about deepened learning or this kind of philosophy behind why do we learn. So let's maybe start with that question. What do you think is the point of knowledge? I mean, why learn?
Well, I think there's two parts of it, and my thinking comes from observation. I observed my students for probably 10 years before I kind of came up with this what I now call a model of deepened, not deep, not deepening, but deepened learning. I think there are two things. One is, and they're both verbs, they're both processes. One is deepening understanding, purpose of learning. deepening understanding of self, others, and world. We want our understanding of ourselves, others, and the our whole in world environment, universe maybe. We want that to be increasing and deepening. We also want to increasingly master our capacities. That's open-ended, I think, maybe advisedly, because we don't necessarily know all our capacities now, right? But we want to identify our capacities, continually identify more capacities, but the capacities that we do know, in education now, we try to think we measure, different capacities in the different fields, in math, science, English, history. Um, but their capacities are huge numbers of capacities, and we want to master more and more capacities. So we want to be able to understand more, and we want to be able to do and think more.
Mm,
To me, that's at the center of a model of learning that I find useful.
I want to highlight something which I think is really important. Your distinction has three parts, which is yourself, others, and the world. Where I think a lot of times people might put others and the world as one. What was the decision to separate those two? Because I think it's really interesting to not have those two be the same.
Mhm. Because I think, and this gets to, you could call it philosophy, but I believe there's a design of things in the world, in nature, in the universe. And I think the model that I'm trying to work with, and I've worked with to some extent so far, and I'm really interested in others' perspectives on. I my hypothesis is that this mirrors the design of how we're designed. We're designed to learn for these reasons, these purposes, and then there's processes that my observations and studies have kind of led me to that I think are also natural.
Mm. And so do you feel that, I mean, there's so many interesting questions here because this belief that humans also, because you separated nature. I mean, the fact that humans are somehow not part of nature is also an interesting kind of like delineation because
Well, I'm
understanding
not sure.
nature could also be understanding humans, right?
I'm not sure I said that we were separate, but
Yeah, no, you didn't say that they're separate, but I guess you mentioned that understanding the world would be understanding processes that were kind of, and you said like understanding nature. But if humans were also part of nature, would that not again be one in this? Understanding the
um,
world would
uh,
also be understanding people.
understanding the 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 whole um, process, the whole project that we're part of, the world, the universe. We are definitely um, inhabitants of a larger context, a world, a universe. But science has told us that there are certain characteristics, laws, certain fundamental truths about the universe on a science, in terms of science. And my hypothesis is there are also certain fundamental design elements in the way human beings learn.
Hmm.
And my thought is that we are missing an entire segment of that we have a region of learning that is not considered in our conception of learning and therefore curriculum.
Hmm. So I'm really curious to hear what you think about this because one another aspect of this conversation, which I think is really interesting, is the discussion around what are the responsibilities of a public school, for example. Like what things should they be teaching versus what things should they probably allow for to be taught either at the home or by a religious community or to allow the parents to kind of choose. This, I think some of the things that you're talking about seem to me, and I would agree, I think all these parts are very integral to education. I'm really curious how that can be done without kind of like treading the lines of religion, like understanding yourself. For example, if I was to tell you you had a soul, I mean, that would be deeply religious in a lot of ways, because some religions ascribe to a belief of soul while others don't. And so to tell you to understand yourself, you must understand your soul. Or to say there's something like an inner child, and to understand yourself is to understand your inner child. How do you kind of tread that line? And maybe some people would argue that it's okay to teach religion at schools, and but we should teach many different religions, and we should
Mhm.
approach, rather than just teaching one approach to understanding these things, we should teach different approaches. What are your thoughts on kind of navigating that conversation?
Well, it's a conversation that needs to be navigated. And the approach, what I found myself doing is creating a project. Project-based learning is something that I was persuaded early on is a very solid, viable way to consider to help students learn in a context. And so the project that I like to say my students and I created is the personal creed is the first one, but then about 10 years later, we began working on the World Wisdom Project.
Hmm.
And the World Wisdom Project, for one thing, when you're studying wisdom, well, you can study perspectives from various religions without being in the crosshairs of separation of church and state, because we're not we're not teaching religion, we're studying wisdom. So wisdom becomes a uh, an important goal of learning in the way I like to think about it. And so just to give you a quick idea, what we did and I'm going to be writing a chapter in the book I'm currently developing on this wisdom project, the World Wisdom Project. First, we have readings, and the readings we make sure that every culture in the room is represented in the readings, wisdom related readings from every culture.
Mm,
For example, we have bits from the Bible, from the Quran. We have Taoist anecdotes, Zen parables. We have something from we used to have something from the Panchatantra, but I'm realizing, no, that's more children's stories. So now we have something from the Bhagavad Gita. It's a video. And then we have whatever we can get from traditional sources we put in. And then we also put in songs, contemporary songs, um,
hmm.
so that we have works that we study from every culture in the room. And Rumi is in there, of course. Amanda Gorman is in there, and we we're looking. Here's the question in this particular project, and I'm not saying this is what you know um, every teacher should do, but our question is: can traditional works of wisdom help us meet the challenges we face today
Mm,
as teenagers? That's one option. They can write about it as a teenager, and so they or not, right? And so they can write on either side of that equation. They can say, no, traditional sources of wisdom really aren't going to help us deal with climate change. And I had an essay written by a guy we interviewed recently, class of 2019, who argued that Congress was dropping the ball and was flying in the face of traditional sources of wisdom with its failure to enact legislation on climate change.
mm,
So we studied sources of wisdom. they interviewed three generations of community members about the whole topic of what is wisdom and what are some examples of wisdom in your culture and in your experience. And then they wrote culminating essays, and
Wow.
those culminating essays are gold.
This is
And
amazing.
it's a great project, and I'd almost could offer a podcast on the World Wisdom Project. But
Yeah.
I think that's one way to address the deep existential questions um, without treading on too many toes.
You know why I really like this? I think from a teacher's perspective, every year you do this and every classroom you do this will be completely different because the people in the class will be different. So the wisdoms that you're now working off of will be very different. And so
Right.
there is no like, this is the base. I'm going to provide you all the readings because that's when I think it can sometimes become problematic, possibly because the teacher is going to have a bias in what they end up selecting, what they consider to be profound versus not profound. And you're going to leave some narratives out as that naturally happens.
You have to.
But
You have to.
when, yeah, but when you give it up to the classroom for every student to bring bits and parts of their history, where they come from, what they understand, then you actually have this really diverse kind of collection of narratives that I think allows you to actually navigate that balance without ever pushing it too far into one person kind of just pushing their own beliefs
Right.
onto another. Wow. Yeah, I really like that idea actually.
That's one of the strong points of the project. Yes, we had certain core readings that year after year engage students. That's what I'm really after, Gautam, is engaging students. That's what I started when I first landed in the classroom. I saw my students. It was I started teaching Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables, and I saw my students really. They just looked different. They sounded different. They moved differently when they were discussing this book. And my antenna go out, and I go, "What's going on here? I want to see more of this. This is what I'm looking for." So, first 10 years of my career, I'm just trying to find, readings, activities, perspectives that lit students up. And I think the Personal Creed Project came out of that whole urge at a time when, before testing and accountability kind of closed a lot of doors. And I began to realize that what students really wanted, was missing in the curriculum, was them. you know,
Hmm.
them giving them a chance to really understand in some kind of systematic manner um,
Mm.
what had shaped them, what influences have shaped them, background circumstances, specific experiences, people, questions, their own personalities, even. Um, and so the Personal Creed Project um, guides students to reflect on these general categories and come up with a small number of um, most significant influences and then a set of values, and then make a presentation out of it. Um, so observing students' increasing enthusiasm for this kind of learning is what inspired me to put together this model of learning.
Mm. I mean, I think I feel very grateful to have been able to speak to you for at least 4 or 5 hours over the last 2 or 3 weeks because I think it's really laying down a deep understanding of where you're coming from and what it is that you're trying to communicate. Because it's making a lot more sense now. And I kind of want to summarize some of the things that I feel like I'm hearing, which is so that if the belief is that the fundamental purpose of all of this learning, everything is these two main goals, which is one, to deepen understanding of yourself, the world, and of others, and also to increase what is possible for humans, not just to stay at what we already have, but what more can we do as a collective species and as an individual. It seems like a project like what you propose, which if any of the listeners are interested in learning more about the Creed project, we go into it extensively in the last episode. That project, particularly, I think a lot of education ends up only focusing on understanding the world. And so the question every student has is, what is the connection of this to me? In what way is this connected to my life? But in
Mhm.
both the wisdom world wisdom, as well as the Creed project, in both of them, there is a direct connection to not only yourself, but to others in your family and your friends and the people who have inspired you and continue to inspire you, but also in understanding who you are. What is it that you want to do with your life, with your future? What are your goals, your dreams, your passions? I mean, and then to present it, to work on your actual capacities, to research, to actually develop those skills, it ties all of it together. And now, when there is an actual reason to learn, no student is going to half-ass it, or no student, because now the reason to actually do it is there. There's no kind of like this is directly impactful for you for X, Y, and Z reason. And
It's
here is how you,
intrinsically it's intrinsically rewarding because it's part of the design of us and
yes.
the universe that we live in. And
Wow.
yeah, um, and if I could add just one thing,
Of course.
yes, the central aim of learning. Those are just my two thoughts, and I'm really open to other thinkers, educators, students, teachers, you know, hammering on that, and maybe we can come up with something more, even more fitting. But I think the processes of that. So if that's the center, I have three ovals that hover around the center. There's two that are at the top, and the upper left. This is your upper left. I'm putting my hand up there. The upper left, you have um, you have mastering facts. I'm so sorry about the dings.
That's okay.
Mastering facts. And mastering facts, the question there is, what do we know? And over here, we have the that is on the upper right, we have interpreting facts to create knowledge. And the question with knowledge is, what does it mean? You know, we have what do we know in the upper left? That has to do with facts, information, facts, even data. What do we know? Let's identify that. And then over here, what does it mean? And that's knowledge. And there's all kinds of knowledge, musical knowledge, science knowledge, knowledge of other human beings, blah, blah, blah. And then the part below, this is the deeper part. There's an oval centered below that central aim of learning. And that is the question there is, who are we? Right? In the upper left, it
Mm,
was, what do we know? Upper right, what does it mean? And the lower at the center, the deeper part, the deepened part is, who are we?
So
And and that's about discovering values. Because when we discover what we value through reflecting on our experiences in life, then we start learning who we really are.
I
That's the missing region of curriculum. That's the missing element of learning. We are content to just, oh, let that happen. Leave that to families, leave that to the street, leave that to whatever. But that is meant, at least my hypothesis, that's meant to be an intrinsic part of education, mastering facts, interpreting facts for knowledge, and um, gaining wisdom. That should
100%.
be engineered into our system of education.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that was really well said. And, it makes me think back to one of the earlier points, which is grades and quantifying education will always be a part of learning so long as part of the system is you going somewhere 500 miles away to like continue your learning, because to transmit some sort of information about how well you perform, you need some way to do that, and it seems one easy way to do that is through numbers. Similarly, when you get placed into a school where you have no relationship with any of the teachers, you're going to be skeptical about them kind of entering this space of wisdom. However, if you were in the system itself, were able to incorporate ways where there are deep relationships between the community leaders and the teachers and the families, then you'll no longer think of these people as strangers. You know them. You know, you've been to their home, you may have had dinner with them, you know them and trust them enough to have these conversations with your children without feeling deeply skeptical. So I think like oftentimes, I mean, I don't think my mom or dad knew a single one of my teachers, at least intimately or personally, to like trust them enough to be like, yeah, let's start having these conversations
Yeah.
together. And there's this kind of disconnect of like we don't trust them fully because we don't know them, and I think that's also fair. And I think so. It seems that I wanted to add one thing, and I'm really curious what you think about this because when I think about learning. I think the thing that I see most missing about those who we consider to be intellectuals or academics or whatever is a lack of joy. I see really stiff people who, when they hear rhythm, can't move. I see people who, when they hear a lovely song, they are too scared or shy to sing, or they're just not free. And
Hmm.
I would want to add because maybe some people would put that into increasing mastery of human capacities, but I'm not talking about dancing to dance well. I'm talking about dancing to express joy or to express freedom.
Hmm.
And so I think the other aspect that I'm working on actually writing about passion and is about the expression of freedom and the expression of joy for the sake of joy, not for the sake of mastery. And I think that is another aspect that's like deeply missing within education. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like it fits somewhere in here already?
I would say so, and I would say it's down in the deeper part, because also underneath the whole that lower hub, which is about discovering values, and wisdom is the arena, and the question is, who are we? Underneath those things are I kind of spell out identity, heart, soul, creativity, relationships, community, intuition, purpose, personality, and certainly we could add joy in there. The great thing about doing this kind of thinking is that it's open, and now the chance to talk with you about this tonight. I don't. Why should joy not belong in those um, associated benefits of discovering values and discovering who we are. We discover who we are. We're people who can move our bodies. We're people who can express ourselves musically with our voices. And so I think that an education that integrates facts, information, knowledge, and wisdom would help people be better dancers, not in competition, but in terms of knowing themselves and dancing themselves, expressing who they are through movement, moving their bodies.
Mm, yeah. I mean, yes. Yeah, I guess that's an interesting way of putting it under the wisdom category. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
right.
I think this right here though is I think what every educator needs to start from. Not your exact understanding of a model of deepened curriculum, but if you are going to be an educator, you have to have some deep understanding of what is the purpose of learning, why does it matter, and how do we connect this? I think one of the really interesting things that I had is when I first started my very first podcast, I was speaking to a lot of teachers,
Hmm.
and they truly didn't really have answers to these questions. Outside of the main one that I heard is it's important to learn so you can get a job and so you can make money to
Yeah,
make it, which is fair. I mean, which for some people based on their upbringings that is the sole purpose of learning and it is so that they can provide for their family for some people that is the reality of what learning is for them, but it's unfortunate when I think most of the educators eventually succumb to that, perhaps because of their own financial struggles as
and
being a
they're
teacher.
and their own upbringings, their own educations. We teach how we were taught, unfortunately.
Hmm. Finding joy for learning, I think, is archaic in a lot of ways. I mean, and I don't think that's alone to education. I mean, I think it's a deeply, in many ways, a capitalist kind of mindset of why you do what you do. I mean, I don't think joy is kind of you can do that on your hobby. That's 2 hours on the side. Don't I mean
Right.
that's not what life is. I mean, life is about a car and a house, and I mean,
Yeah.
joy is that's a hobby. You know,
Well,
it's
and
yeah.
part of the reason that we come to those that we don't question those assumptions is that our teachers didn't question them, and our teachers gave us their own set of, and even those teachers probably deep inside themselves, they knew there was a lot more they wished they were teaching, and um, didn't know how because it had never been taught to them. I was in 2004. I was asked to write a book. I won an award came to me, and after the award, the opportunity to write a book came to me, and I'm going to write a book about learning. And I saw that my first question was, well, what is the purpose of learning? I had to ask myself that. How could I write a book about learning if I couldn't explain what the purpose of learning was? And that's when I really started thinking about all this, and have been refining for the last 20 years. I've been refining this whole notion of a model of deepened learning. And I'm still refining it. This conversation I'm having with you is helping me think about it in additional new ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating to me how much self-help, how many books are written out there without actually answering that question first. What is the point? I mean,
Yeah,
why? Like, why are we doing any of it? And I think that's how I actually found my way into falling in love with all this education stuff. Is my original question was, what is the point of any of why live? What is the point? I actually am quite confused why we continue to reproduce. Why are we even continuing? And it
that's
led me to
honorable.
educate, and it
That's
led me. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. I just have to interject. That's an honorable question, and I salute you for asking it. Now, go ahead.
No, I mean, and it led me to education because the entire premise of education is that it's worth learning this for some reason, and we believe that that some reason is worthy enough for you to continue living. And that's the
Yep,
only reason we're going to put all this effort into teaching you this, because we personally believe that it's worth continuing humanity forward. And so I was like, okay, well, if that's a premise that all of education is built on, then let's talk about that premise is how did we get here? And so that's where I have found every culture, every family differs so much in why they believe all of this is worth it. And I think that's like where the most rich differences exist between people of like, why do they think living itself is worth it?
absolutely. And as you say, that's one of the great benefits of growing up in a global community such as Fremont, because you get a chance growing up to be with kids who have a lot of different perspectives on things. This book that I mentioned to you a while back, I'm not finding this book that gave me a lot of inspiration and thought to help develop this model of learning. And one of
Mm,
the things that James Moffat says is that he spent a quarter of a century um, laboring to bring more enlightenment, understanding to education. And he said that there's so little progress, right? That sometimes he almost felt like giving up, but he kept coming back to schools. And you know why?
mm,
Because that's where the kids were.
mm,
That's where the kids were. And the kids, the students, are the ones that, with a little bit of support and guidance, I mean, the Personal Creed Project came out of me watching them
mm.
and thinking about them and what engaged them. And again, I think I might have mentioned this earlier. Um, most days of my career, I was inspired. I felt inspired just by being around dynamic young people.
Mhm. For those out there who might be thinking about going into the teaching profession, what would you say to them? Would you recommend it?
I would recommend that you don't believe everything you're taught as in your teacher training. I would I would suggest that if you can, you think about the teachers who've inspired you the most and see what you can emulate from their example. And another thing I would say that if you have a nature that is curious and a little bit rebellious, I would suggest you don't be afraid to fly under the radar and do some things, try some things that aren't guaranteed to meet with the approval of your superiors if you feel that they would be beneficial for your students.
Mm. I mean, I just think it's interesting because I feel like we've only tapped the surface of all the experiences that you've had in 35 years. I guess maybe one of the last questions, and we can leave it here, is if you could think back to your proudest moment as a teacher, the moment where you felt like everything made sense and it was worth it, what would that moment be?
Well, yeah, I'm just going to pick on one that just happened recently. One of my most inspiring students came to me after his mother was killed in a car crash in the spring. Um, his father had never been in his life, and he lived with his grandmother. And he was exceptional from the moment I met him. He had questions that nobody else had, and he didn't have any family support at all. So eventually, he got expelled, went to continuation school. We kept in touch. He wound up staying with me and my wife for on and off for a while, had some very difficult times, um, had severe mental illness, lived on the streets for 5 years, um, fell into fentanyl addiction, and made a recovery. He is now studying to become a substance abuse counselor. And I got a book from him recently in the mail. In fact, I was speaking with you on one of our earlier podcasts, and I got a text from my former student who's now in his early 30s. And he said, "Did you get the book I sent you?" And I go, "Book? No." Went outside, and here was a book. He sent me a book called The Road to Wisdom. And the first time we really had a conversation, it was about the World Wisdom Project in 2005 when he was 14 years old, had just lost his mother. And that's when his brilliance really impressed me the most. So knowing that he's picked himself up out of some very difficult circumstances and he still considers me a friend, um, that's one of my proudest moments in my whole life, really.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. It feels like that is truly an honor. I feel like being a educator or facilitator, teacher, whatever you'd like to call it, but to be able to have those relationships where you do feel like your presence and what you have to say can really connect with somebody like that to where they want to stay in touch with you and it moves them in certain ways. And yeah, good
And
work.
and and they continue inspiring you. I mean, it isn't one way.
Yeah.
I was inspired and still am inspired by other people. I'm a people collector. That's one thing I know about myself. I collect interesting, fascinating, precious people.
Hmm. Thank you so much for your time for this podcast, but also for your 3.5 decades of teaching. I mean, I never was able to have you as a teacher, but it's always fascinating how the people that I do know who do have you still speak so highly of you now. And it was always kind of like it's funny because to someone who's listening who doesn't get the context, you're always kind of like a fable, or like, what's the word for it? Like a legend at the
A
school.
mirage.
Yeah, kind of just like, oh, like, we meditated in class today, we did this and that, and the rest of us are just like sleeping, just, zonked out of our mind, tired. But to hear kind of the experiences a lot of people had in your class, so thank you for all the effort and time you put into the craft and into teaching for so long.
Well, it's a gift to me. So yeah, it's mutual. Um, I think it's natural, you know. I think this kind of being able to connect with students and in a way that brings everyone more, I don't know, fulfillment. I think it's the way it's meant to be.
Mm,
Thank you, though.
yeah. This was a lovely conversation. I'm glad we were able to speak for so many times in the last 2 weeks. It's definitely made me a lot happier. So I'm glad
Well,
we were able to talk.
I'm willing to keep this up anytime. I love speaking with you. I salute you for the work you're doing, traveling in different countries and finding, getting perspectives from educators around the world. I mean, goodness.
Yeah.
Let me
Well,
know if,
yeah.
yeah,
Keep bouncing ideas off each other and let's see what we can do for Fremont
yeah,
education.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We, like I mentioned, there is that initiative going on at Irvington. I think I might be speaking too soon on that, but we'll see.
But yeah, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, though.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.